Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome. I'm very glad to welcome Roy Page Shipp, who's talking to us all the way from Gauteng. Roy Page Shipp studied physics at Natal, an MSc, and worked in science and technology related fields throughout his career, the last 22 years of which were at the CSIR. He is a lifelong singer and music lover, and he has followed this up with retirement studies in music education, which yielded about a dozen published papers, co-authored with people like Caroline van Niekerk and others. Roy, thank you very much for your preparation and for speaking to us today, and we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Gert, and good morning to everyone in the Overberg U3A. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. As Gert indicated, since my retirement, my two main activities and interests have been music and theology. And so this problematic that's appeared to pop up between music and spirituality attracted a lot of my attention. And I believe that the McGill Chris dual hemisphere model, which emerged in my mind or in my ken a couple of years ago, helps us to understand exactly what's going on there. And that's what I'm going to try and do in the next while. Are we talking about two very different concepts? Music is very familiar to us. It's a real physical thing. It's detected through the senses, mainly hearing. It's even capable of depiction as a very complex waveform on a computer screen. Our experience of a given piece of music is nevertheless individuals. Other hearers, although exposed to the same sounds, may react differently. Mature individuals such as ourselves may sometimes even be enraged by loud modern dance music from next door. Spirituality, on the other hand, has a relationship to the numinous. It's a much more mysterious, intangible phenomenon. Some might even call it transcendent, partly because others in the same space may be oblivious to any spiritual aspects. So when we seek to make comparisons between music and spirituality, are we not making a category mistake? Comparing apples with pears, or even worse, apples with fuel consumption. In this presentation, I will be looking at a way of putting music and spirituality into a single framework, exploring a common perspective that will help our understanding of these apparently totally dissimilar things. Now, we must be careful when we formulate comparisons, not to do it in a way that obscures insight. The evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker famously, or perhaps notoriously, called music mere plinking sounds. This is rather like saying that ballet is nothing but a spectacle of skinny girls waving their legs around, or opera as nothing but overweight people bawling loudly at each other in a foreign language, both with orchestral accompaniment. We need to avoid that sort of nothing buttery. And that's a term that McGill Chris uses for any attempt to dismiss a complex phenomenon by oversimplifying it, thereby driving out the context, which provides richness of comprehension and of understanding. Most importantly, what you see is significantly determined by what you look for. Our search should therefore involve a style of exploration that elevates or broadens our understanding, rather than narrowing it or diminishing it. In summary, I'm suggesting an approach that is broad rather than narrow, enabling observation of several mental processes being underway simultaneously, reflecting necessary detail, but within a much wider context. So what is our model for today? Let's have a look at our roadmap for this morning. We'll start off by thinking a bit about models and metaphors and how we use them to create understanding when we deal with complex matters. We'll then clarify what we mean when we speak of the two concepts, spirituality, especially as a feeling, and then music as a very technical construct, but with the power also to evoke feelings. Then there will be a description of McGill Chris' metaphor of the master and his emissary, supported by the dual hemisphere model, which we will apply to music and spirituality. So, to models and metaphors that we're going to explore as they help us to understand the complexities of our world. Because we often use a conceptual model or a metaphor to help us both understand the challenging features of the world and also to share our thoughts about it with others. But we need to be aware that any model is just that and does not necessarily reflect the complete picture. An early example is the three-tier universe, which is how people, in considering religious matters, saw the situation. You can see the three-tier model on some iconostases at the front of some Orthodox churches still. And the pattern is similar in all cases. Heaven's on top, earth is in the center, and hell is below. Those three tiers were thought to represent that particular reality. In a very different context is the Bohr model of the atom. Now, most of you will be familiar with this, probably, but the idea that we could create a model of the fine structure of the atom was a very exciting concept in the 1960s when I was a third-year physics student. It had only been developed about 30 years prior to that. These days, it's familiar to many 8th grade school children. This is what it looks like in the slide. Now, no sane physicist would believe that this is a real view, but she would know that the model is adequate to explain practically all of chemistry, including the quantum effects. Thanks to inquisitive physicists supported by vastly complex and expensive accelerators, the picture now includes deeper layers of more quaint, smaller particles like quarks and bosons. But the point about the Bohr model is that it remains useful when its use is confined to an appropriate range. Now, we're all familiar with maps, whether large sheets of paper or cell phone screens containing a representation of towns and connecting roads, as well as some other features. Useful as these are in planning our trips and finding our way, they are very different to the realities we see as we drive down the roads. The significant principle is the map is not the territory. My attempts to use the McGill Chris model on the challenging subject of music and spirituality should be read in this context. So let's start with spirituality, the apparently more challenging concept. Humans have always shown a concern with the transcendent, sometimes calling it supernatural, mystical, or otherworldly, but these words tend to push one away from understanding and downplay the reality of the experience. It took a celebrated biologist to derive an approach that tightened up the characterization of that numinous experience called spirituality, and he did that in the middle of the 20th century. It was Sir Alistair Hardy, and he suggested that the transcendent is at the core of spirituality, arguing that it is the essential element of spiritual experience. He therefore proposed and widely publicized a question: have you ever been aware of or been influenced by a presence or power, whether you call it God or not, that is different from your everyday self? That presence and power I've highlighted on the slide. We will talk about it on numerous occasions. In the modern era, the balance has shifted a little bit away from God, although Hardy found that about half his contacts felt that their experience was to be called God, and the other believed that they had such experiences but did not relate them to God. The percentage of adults who identify as God-fearing in the West, in any case, is declining, while remaining generally high in some of the less developed nations. However, even as reported religious affiliation decreases, the numbers of respondents who acknowledge a sense of non-God transcendent experiences may remain steady or even increase. Modern man has not discarded the transcendent, a fascinating study in itself, but for another day. Non-religious examples of spiritual experiences that people help to get, that use to get in touch with their spiritual selves, arise through quiet reflection, time in nature, yoga, possibly meditation. Others might feel taken out of themselves by anything from a love song to a beautiful sunset. It seems valid, therefore, to characterize spirituality thus as a feeling, something of which we are aware without any apparent supporting physical aspect. Let's give this some detailed attention. Feeling is a word that is capable of many interpretations. Physiologists refer to some feelings as being essential to focus the body and mind on deviations away from homeostasis. Homeostasis being defined as a healthy state that is maintained by the constant adjustment of biochemical and physiological pathways. An example of this is the requirement for survival that the human core body temperature must remain between 36.5 degrees Celsius and 37.5 degrees Celsius for us to survive. Tendencies to move away from this thermal balance will trigger unconscious responses, such as a change in peripheral blood flow to protect the core from excessive heat or cold. When these unbidden responses falter, we feel hot or cold and do something about it. We move into or out of the sun, or add or remove an item of clothing. Although these physical mechanisms are autonomic responses, that is, they are triggered from within, clearly, where we have to make choices, the mind comes into action. There are other feelings, such as love and even humor or amusement, that are much more difficult to deal with in this way, because although real to the subject, they are revealed only by the subject's own behavior and are not detectable by any independent measuring technique. A particularly interesting example relates to consciousness. The subject usually has no difficulty in knowing whether he is conscious or unconscious, but only his behavior will reveal this to another person. The awareness of a power or presence described by Hardy is very much in this category. So perhaps this is further justification for calling spirituality a feeling. Now, this section would be incomplete without reference to the heart, traditionally viewed as the seat of the emotions. Although brain-like neurons have been discovered in the heart muscle, any reactions and decisions must be registered in the brain, because all those neurons connect only to the brain. So the heart, in this sense, is possibly a dodgy model. There's another issue which might occur to some of you. That's the matter of what is called flow with a capital F. It was contributed to our understanding by a celebrated psychologist called McGill Chris. It's always a useful name to quote because you can show off that you're able to actually say that. But anyway, Csikszentmihalyi, who identified experiences of deep happiness and concentration in persons, and he described them as flow. Persons in flow are totally absorbed in personally rewarded activity. He illustrates the state by reference to surgeons who conduct intricate operations for which total concentration is necessary, but who seem to be able to sustain this concentration for hours. Then not only this, but they look forward to a regular repetition. Test-level cricketers who bat for several hours call this being in the zone, where surmounting the vagaries of the pitch surface and the guile of the bowlers is at the same time demanding and deeply satisfying. This seems to me to be a valid but relatively narrow perspective. I'm looking for something wider. In music, of course, flow seems to be most likely in performers who become absorbed in the production of a complex piece, more so than their listeners. Right, well, now what about music? Music is a purely physical thing. It arises from vibrations in the air, it impacts on the eardrum and thence to the brain. We need a medium for transmission of music so that we can hear it. And there's an awful lot of technology, or let's just call it technical aspects to music. For instance, In the Western system, we recognize only 12 specific frequencies, the chromatic octave, but it's repeated in multiples, about 7 of them on a standard piano, but always the same 12 and doubling every time. Each of those frequencies is called a note. There are different arrangements of sharps and flats around the C major octave to give us scales. The composer specifies sequence and duration of notes, building up tunes and ultimately a score. And there's a standard notation to be used to record a score. Notes can also be played singly or in harmonizing groups. And one of the things that I've certainly discovered is that the keyboard is a very useful model of what all of this is. In the top left corner, you can see the group of 12 members of the chromatic scale, labeled C, D, E, F, G, A, B. For some reason, musicians start with C and go back to B, but nobody seems to know why. And in between those white keys on the piano, you get the accidentals, C sharp, E flat, and those 5, together with the 8, or rather the 7, make up your 12-point chromatic scale. And on a typical 88-key piano keyboard, they're all laid out from left to right, like that. Now, understanding all of this stuff is what's called music theory. And I've only put it in so much detail to remind you of just how complex it can be. If you didn't follow it, please don't worry, it's not important to understand the rest of what I'm going to say. But here's an example of what a pianist who's playing a Chopin nocturne has to learn from. The medium that is used to convey what Chopin composed to our pianist is shown in this slide. Now, this is a very tiny excerpt from a Chopin nocturne. It would take less than 5 seconds to play. But you can see an awfully large number of little black golf stick symbols. They're scattered over 2 grids, one treble at the top, bass at the bottom. The treble is played by the right hand, the bass are played by the left hand, but it's quite obvious that the intervals at which the player has to hit those keys, and they have to be hit accurately, and the timing of them is determined, and it is very, very complex. People like me, who don't play the piano, feel that this must be absurdly difficult. What contradicts that, in fact, is that really quite small children are able to master quite a lot of such music and either learn from following what somebody else is doing or become able to read that score. Now, specifically a defined array of notes like this, each note having a different duration determined by its shape, or a pitch determined by its position on the grid, and sometimes with information as to the intensity with which it should be played, could actually be, and sometimes is in fact, simulated on a computer. But there would be no feeling put into it by the performer or experienced by the listener. So an accomplished pianist works continually on making tiny adjustments to duration and intensity to create an intensity that is pleasing to him. I had the privilege just recently of listening to a recital by the celebrated pianist Bessel van Wyk, who until recently taught at Tuckey's and is an old chum of Caroline's. And he shared with me, he's a very approachable man, and I had a chat with him after the session, that he finds himself, after a lifetime of doing this sort of thing, continually feeling that some of these adjustments are important. Now, even a simple tune needs some nuancing to be interesting. How about this? I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. Now, you probably will recognize that as a Bing Crosby song. I don't suppose too many of you thought it was actually a recording of Bing Crosby and realized that it was Roy pretending to be Bing Crosby. Although I was using the same notes, the effect was unmistakably different. And that's what gives music much of its richness, is that individuals make such a huge difference in exactly how the music sounds. Now, there are other types of music beyond singing. There are orchestras and operas, which are very, very complex arrays of many people, but typically in the classical music category that I've been describing. Then there's jazz, and there's pop, and there's dance music, where the key element is the beat. All of these require some understanding of music theory, whether or not it's conscious. Jazz musicians add the so-called seventh to create special chords, which add an individual effect in combinations of sounds when they improvise over the tune or theme. Improvisation being one of the special characteristics of jazz music. It creates different feelings in the hearer or the player. The top instrumentalists have a very clear understanding of the technical aspects of music, as do some celebrated popular musicians. The Beatles are an interesting case. Most of us would admit that they are were extremely innovative in their music, but many books, and quite a number of even academic books have been written about this, emphasize that they were not celebrated for the extent of their knowledge of music theory. Their music was not written down, at least not by them. In fact, they were inclined to dismiss the notion that reading and writing music notation was important, but they did comply with many of the conventions of music structure. Now, if this seems very difficult and complex, it is difficult and complex. I've been through all this above to emphasize the point that the technical aspects of music performance are very challenging. So what about feelings in music? Up to and including the point of getting all the notes right, any music is easily reproducible on a computer, as I just said. We could term this phase objective. And if everybody tried to play in exactly that same way, that would be one aspect of what happened. And the outcomes, although they would be identical, would not be very expressive. It would be difficult for them to evoke a reaction or feeling in the listener. This requires a personal intervention by the performer. It also depends on the listener, so that no two performers or listeners experience a piece in the same way. Now we're moving into the subjective, and this is where we encounter a bridge from the hard, objective facts of correct note sequences to variable, subjectively felt emotions or moods induced in the performer or the listener, indeed, their feelings. And this applies to all forms of music, although the nature and vigor of the feelings that different pieces evoke, as indicated by the reactions accompanying them, can be very different. Do these notes and combinations have neural correlates? In other words, something that relates to those particular aspects going on in the brain? Well, I'm reminded of the excitement that Daniel Levitin created among musicians with his book, This Is Your Brain on Music, which came out in 2006. He showed how various techniques that were new at the time, such as fMRI, had revealed that the properties of music, like pitch, rhythm, contour, can be associated with different organs in the brain, the so-called neural correlates. But this begged the question, where is the music in the brain? And these neurological techniques don't actually help us to answer that question. But McGill Chris' work suggests an answer, and it's time we got around to him. So let's talk about McGill Chris', skip that one, book, The Master and His Emissary. But first, a bit about McGill Chris himself. He's a very interesting character. He started life as an expert in English literature. He was a fellow of All Souls. But he decided that that wasn't really what he wanted to do and became a medical doctor and then a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist. In the process, and following some of his thinking and work around this, he has been a fellow of All Souls twice more. But he's now an author and speaker. Interestingly, he lives on the Isle of Skye. Now, having followed this varied career, McGill Chris developed a novel view of the brain. He noted that the human brain is divided into two hemispheres. They have essentially similar anatomical content. But that begs the question, why should there be two? Why not just one big sphere? Also, the two hemispheres have different significant shape. And these differences in shape are consistent in all humans. The left hemisphere is not exactly the same shape as the right hemisphere. This suggests that they might have different functions. But the hemispheres are joined by a large communication organ, the corpus callosum, which lies between them and is a channel for many neurological impulses that go backwards and forwards all the time. So there they are, two hemispheres with different functions, but continually talking to each other in more common terms. Now, he undertook the analysis of many case studies of the specific behaviors of persons with defects in or damage to specific parts of the brain. Now, if a loss of function is correlated with damage to an organ, then one can associate that function with a specific organ. The data suggest important differences in function for different regions of the brain determined in this way. The process is known as the elision method. I'm going to repeat it, in fact, because it's absolutely at the root of what we're saying. If someone has suffered damage to the brain, or possibly has a congenital defect, it's reasonable to expect that they would have different functions to a fully functional brain. And those differences can then be associated with the damaged part. So the understanding of many ways in which the various organs in the brain work together is worth having a look at. In his book, The Master and His Emissary, he quotes over 100 case studies. Now, from all this work, and of course philosophical and other considerations, McGill Chris developed the model, The Master and His Emissary. Here we come to a model, with the master being represented by the right hemisphere and the emissary, the left. His rationale is set out in 600 pages in his first book, The Master and His Emissary. The way it works is the model is of an emissary who is sent on a journey to discover some information which the master requires to put into a wider context. Now, this is really quite a challenging topic to sum up in a few sentences, and to try it is obviously rash, but I'm going to try anyway. Let's look at the slide. In the Gilchrist model, the emissary is a highly focused, detail-obsessed being who believes that what is directly occupying his attention is the only subject in existence. The emissary is thus readily able to focus on and deal with detailed conceptual structures and objects, for example, facts, masses of facts, and to organize them, language, mathematics, playing music. The master, on the other hand, possesses a wide-ranging contextual knowledge. He takes the broad view. It has both spatial and temporal depth, and can relate any fact or concept produced by the emissary to others in the master's mind, and the master does this continually. The master directs the focus of the emissary to something he requires to expand his overall view when the emissary reports back. And as I said, the two hemispheres are in continuous communication. In the human mind, as with the master-emissary legends, that this conversation, it continues all the time. And I remind you once again that the emissary may convince himself that his world is all there is. Now, let's look at some activities that illustrate the shared behavior. Simplest example relates to birds, which are known to use their two eyes independently, some even having eyes situated on opposite sides of the head. Birds can focus the left hemisphere exclusively on a task, for example, efficiently picking up an edible seed from a background of other small objects, while the right hemisphere is able to monitor the surroundings for possible enemies, to remember other similar situations, and therefore to be able to plan to visit alternate feeding sites, to move away from a particular patch of seeds to an apparently richer one some distance away. That's certainly in my reading and experience the easiest way to understand the difference between two halves of the human brain. There's an interesting human physiological example. At the center of our human retinas is a high pixel density portion, which is used to focus on small print or delicate objects, just like the left hemisphere, or presumably with the assistance of the left hemisphere, while the remainder of the retina observes the surrounding space, the right hemisphere, but at a very much lower level of detail. This is a distinction familiar to those of you who are sufferers from adult macular degeneration. Another example, in human speech, to express a complete thought or idea, the right hemisphere can draw suitable words from a dictionary equivalent left hemisphere. And this would involve, of course, extremely rapid exchange through the corpus callosum. So how do we apply this dual hemisphere model to music? If you're creating and performing a piece, this requires the left hemisphere with its significant cognitive understanding of arrays of symbols. I showed you that excerpt from Chopin's Nocturne, and gave you an understanding of just how complex that can be. To turn it into music requires formidable understanding of what each symbol means, but also physical control. Each note and each phrase must be accurate and in time with a combination of the fingers and the keys. The same applies to any other instrument, of course, whether you're pressing the tabs on a flute or stroking different strings and different lengths and adjusting the lengths of the string you're stroking with a violin. Ones who have it easiest, of course, are singers. Although people who think that singers simply stand up and do it don't appreciate the extensive study and practice and technology of controlling your body while you're generating those sounds. Nevertheless, it's a very left hemisphere sort of thing. You've got to have it, or there's no music, at least not music produced by humans. On the right hemisphere involves both the performer and the listeners, because these arrays of sounds evoke feelings. And we also realize the performer needs to enhance his behavior, and the listeners need to enhance their reactions by making adjustments, by thinking in different ways, by focusing their hearing. And all of them, all the time, are putting it into context. Is it familiar? How many previous performances have you seen? How different were they? What do you know about the origins of the music, the composer, the environment, the context in which it was composed? What was the impact of the personality of the composer, the impact of the personality of the performer, and the impact of the personality and the listener? A whole different bunch of activities that are needed. Now, let's apply this model to other familiar types of music. And I hope that in the process, you will think up your own examples, either now or possibly later. We can start by reflecting on the examples where the music leads us to be aware of a higher power. And I've called the environment that we find ourselves in when we're listening to and engaging music a soundscape, and by sort of a parallel with the notion of a landscape. In the early church music, we know it well through having listened to things like Gregorian chants. The music appears quite simple, but it is very beautiful, and it requires concentration to produce it. But the members of religious communities who sing them are evoking a soundscape for themselves of worship, of contemplation, and also fellowship. Many of you will have sung the Hallelujah chorus. And if you're singing it with a group of people, the Hallelujah from the Messiah, you would experience a different kind of emotions, different feelings to what you would experience if you were singing the grand finale from HMS Pinafore, for instance, the Gilbert and Sullivan opera. The feelings that would be evoked would be very different. Pinafore doesn't make you think of a great power. The Hallelujah chorus certainly does. Another example. In the mountain up above Ephesus is a little chapel called the Meryemama, or Mary's house in Turkish. It's believed to be the place where Mary spent the last period of her life, having been conducted there by John. It's a highly unlikely story in that context, but it means things to people. And the Meryemama has become what is called by the Irish a thin place, a place where it's easy to make contact with your Maker, to make contact with God, to feel yourself to be closer to God. That's why it's a thin place. Certainly, when Connie and I were there, we spent a considerable time just sitting in the chapel. There was nobody chanting or singing or praying around it. Nobody was there other than us at that particular point. But somehow, all that activity that's happened down the years had done something about that place. And if it's difficult for you to understand, it's difficult for us to understand as well, but it was real. Still sticking with the God-related ones, possibly. This year on Good Friday, we sang The Old Rugged Cross in church. Now, that's a rather sentimental piece. I don't necessarily get excited about some of the images and the way they're evoked in that particular piece, but I've sung it on many, many occasions, very often either in choir or in quartets. And as I was singing it, what did I remember? I could remember all of those friends, people I sang with 40 years ago. Many of them, of course, have since died. But just singing creates a different kind of feeling about the song itself and what it means to you. Now, some of the examples, of course, are about non-religious spiritual soundscapes. We all know or have heard that in the early days when the Springboks went to Wales for the first time, they happened to find themselves listening to, before the game began, several thousand Welshmen singing Ma hen glad by Nadw an will I meet. That's the Welsh national anthem, and they all sing it. And the Springboks would report just how intimidating is that dimension that they bring into it of victory, of partiality for their own team, of contempt for their opponents. And it's all in this wonderful shared activity of a Welsh crowd. Completely different examples. During World War II, soldiers at the front found themselves being taken to concerts. And the concert was very frequently, if they were very lucky, conducted by a young lady called Vera Lynn. Now, Vera Lynn had a wonderful, mellow voice, but she wasn't a glamour girl. She didn't get heavily made up. She didn't wear outrageous clothes. In fact, she tended to dress as if she was going to church. But she could make a couple of hundred soldiers who'd managed to get a breakaway from the front, sing along with a piece like, "If you were the only pearl in the world, and I was the only boy." Getting Englishmen in large numbers to sing like that's not easy, but she could do it. Now, why? Because every one of those servicemen had somewhere around him a photograph that a girl or a woman had given him before he left, sent him off to the front with a photograph with scrawled on the back, "Come home to me." And Vera Lynn represented that girl to those soldiers. Now, if that isn't something more than just the sounds of the music or the loudspeakers vibrating, I don't know. So I hope you thought of some examples of your own. Let's just sum this up. The exploration of the relationship between music and spirituality must consider that both have elements of feeling. In the case of music, this can stem from a wide range of detailed actions and sound construction that are necessary to produce those feelings with the assistance of a performer. The McGill Chris model of the master and his emissary provides a thinking framework that can be used to describe this, with the left hemisphere dominating most of the progression prior to the evocation of the feeling in the right hemisphere. But once the music is there, the feelings emerge at the end of a chain of construction that starts with a single note and passes through stages of increasing complexity to produce a piece. Only when this piece is performed and heard, with variations introduced by the imagination and skill of the performers, are feelings evoked in the right hemisphere that can cover a wide range: memories, a desire to sing along, a feeling of upliftment, possibly an awareness of a power or presence that you're not normally experiencing. Music can inspire confidence. It can evoke sadness. So the original thought, if we believe that there's something to do with music and spirituality, and we've all had experiences where music evokes different feelings, what's going on? Well, the Gilchrist dual hemisphere model does indeed give us an additional perspective on the relationship between music and spirituality. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Roy, thank you very much. And thank you for the preparation and the detailed presentation. There's so much to think about. Let me ask you one question. Do you think there's a difference between music that is specifically written as spiritual music, like hymns, that will evoke certain feelings, versus other music that also engenders feelings and may actually have a spiritual element to it, although it's not written specifically as so-called spiritual music?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here, Kat. The first one is that music that is written specifically for religious purposes usually involves words, of course, and so the words can evoke feelings as well as the music. But we do know that straight music, and it's, to use the same example, if you hear the tune being played on an organ, you know what you're going to sing, and your feelings are evoked right from that point before you even start singing words. The intention, of course, of plain song, the chant that I was talking about earlier on, is to distract people from what's going on around them and get them focused. It works quite well, in fact, if you've ever tried it. I mean, we all know that the Buddhists sing Om Mani Padme Hum. Now, we don't do that in the Christian church, but the words we sing tend to have a similar way of creating this context, this broader picture that is, well, certainly the subject of what McGill Chris is saying.
A second item in my mind is the use of different instruments. I mean, for instance, the bagpipes would evoke certain specific feelings amongst Scottish people, but even if they go to war with the pipes in the background. The organ definitely is normally associated with a church. It doesn't have to be so exclusively. But would you also make a difference between the feelings evoked by different instruments?
Well, one must, you're quite right. I happen to love the pipes. One of the best experiences that Connie and I have ever had was to go to the what do they call it, that takes place on the parade,
the Edinburgh Tattoo.
I've never ever had the feeling that I want to go to war. I'm a reasonably peaceable guy, but I still love the sound that it makes and the excitement that it generates. But there's a story that when the South Africans were fighting at Alamein, you know, in those days, the doctrine of warfare on the ground was that you'd lay down a barrage and soften up the opposition, and then you'd start lifting the barrage, and coming in behind the barrage would be the tanks, who would provide further distraction, and then the infantry had to come along because men on their feet had to do some of the tidying up and all sorts of activities and fighting that they had to do. And it's recorded that at El Alamein, I think it was Alamein, it was one of the great battles anyway of that war, that for some reason or other, the troops were reluctant to move. They just didn't seem to be able to get going. And the bagpiper of the Black Watch at the time, which was one of the regiments involved, which was attached to one of the regiments involved, the head piper said, "Come on, lads, we've got to go." And they hauled out their bagpipes and started to play, and the troops started to move. Now, that's, of course, a legend that Scottish people love and people who love the pipes love. I believe it might be true. In wartime in the Highlands, I think that was very much the case. It was intended to get people out of a lethargic kind of viewpoint and get them moving. It worked for them. I've never had to go to war like that, praise God, but I still love the pipes as well. And I can understand why the Queen Mother was celebrated to have wanted a piper outside her bedroom window every morning, and the guy would walk up and down playing. Obviously, he didn't play martial music to a great extent, and there is some romantic music that can be played on the bagpipes, but it meant something to her.
Roy, I also think there's a big difference between music you know and understand versus music you don't. Eastern music may have significant religious feelings for certain people, whereas if I don't understand it, it'll have no impact on me, and vice versa with certain Western music. Would you agree?
Oh, yes. Yeah, music is very much part of our culture, part of our background. It's part of our context. It's what we learned. It's what we've done. You know, it's part of our lives. Although I find it interesting is that we were in China some little while ago, and we were encountered some of the Chinese instruments. Well, you'll recall, I spoke about it in a previous presentation. And this weird violin-type instrument with only two strings called the erhu produces a weird, that's what we call it. In the West, we call it a weird, eerie kind of sound. But if you've listened to enough of it, which I have, it starts to really mean something to you. And I think that's the point. It's what we're used to. If you've ever heard one of these ensembles in Indonesia of bells, you know, they can have 8 or 9, 10, 15 different types of bells and they play together. It's not quite the sort of thing we're used to, but if you listen to it for a while, it becomes beautiful. So I think it's very much a matter of context and experience and whether your right brain is ready for it or not. Yeah.
But I think it applies even to Western music. I often find if I listen to a new piece of classical music that I've not heard before, it may take me once or twice or 3 times to listen to it before I really appreciate it.
Well, that's exactly the point, isn't it? Yes, because you know what's coming and you've got a feeling of what it was like last time. I agree with you. I mean, some modern music, I sometimes feel I could listen to it forever and never appreciate it. But certainly the sort of classical romantic composers that we were brought up with, nobody ever loves Beethoven the first time they hear it, or Mozart even less. But it's hard to imagine your life without Beethoven and Mozart once you've been exposed to them on many occasions.
Roy, thank you very much. It's a fascinating subject. There's obviously a lot more to talk about and to learn. Thank you for your preparation and for being willing to share it with us. All the best to you.
It's a very great pleasure, and thank you for listening and for your questions.